Good evening and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight we share 6 true trucker horror stories from deep woods of Appalachian. If you are new here, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Now let's begin. The rain was coming down in sheets that October night when Emma Chen spotted the figure on the side of a remote mountain highway, deep in the heart of West Virginia's Appalachian wilderness. She'd been driving cross-country freight for 8 years, and company policy was crystal clear: no hitchhikers, no exceptions. But something about the hunched silhouette standing in the downpour, barely visible through her windshield wipers, made her ease off the accelerator. Emma had always prided herself on being practical, level-headed. She wasn't the type to believe in gut feelings or supernatural nonsense. But as her headlights swept across the figure, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October storm. The person, an elderly man she could see now, wasn't trying to flag her down. He wasn't even looking at the road. Instead, he stood perfectly still, staring into the dense forest that pressed against the highway like a living wall. Against every regulation in her handbook, Emma pulled her 18-wheeler to the shoulder. The air brakes hissed as she came to a stop, and for a moment she questioned her sanity. The smart thing would be to drive on, leave whoever it was to wait for someone else. But the storm was getting worse, and something about the old man's stillness troubled her in ways she couldn't explain. She rolled down her passenger window and called out through the rain, "Hey, you need a ride?" The man turned toward her truck with movements that seemed stiff, deliberate. In her headlights, she could see he was ancient, maybe 70 or 80 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to another era, a worn wool coat, heavy work boots, and a hat that had seen decades of weather. He approached her cab slowly, and when he looked up at her through the passenger window, Emma felt her breath catch. His eyes were sharp, alert, but held something that made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. Not malice exactly, but a kind of desperate urgency that seemed at odds with his measured movements. "Much obliged, miss," he said, his voice carrying the thick mountain accent of old-time Appalachia. "Storm's getting worse, and these roads ain't safe tonight." There was something in the way he said "tonight" that made Emma's skin crawl. But she leaned over and unlocked the passenger door anyway. The old man climbed into her cab with surprising agility, bringing with him the smell of wet earth and something else, something organic and ancient that reminded Emma of mushrooms growing in dark places. As he settled into the passenger seat, she noticed his clothes weren't just old-fashioned. They were soaked through, but the water seemed to bead and roll off them in ways that defied physics. "Name's Ezra," he said, removing his hat to reveal white hair that somehow remained dry despite the storm. "Been walking these mountains longer than I care to remember." Emma introduced herself and put the truck back in gear, pulling onto the empty highway. "Where you headed, Ezra?" "Don't matter much," he replied, and she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "What matters is you keep driving till daylight, miss. Don't stop for nothing, you understand? Don't even slow down." The urgency in his voice made Emma glance at him sharply. "What are you talking about?" Ezra was staring out the passenger window into the wall of trees that lined the road. "They're watching tonight. Can feel 'em stirring in the deep woods. Been quiet for months, but something's got 'em active again." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light of her dashboard, his eyes seemed to reflect like an animal's. "You picked a bad night to drive this stretch alone." Emma felt a laugh bubble up nervously. "They? Who's they?" "The Watchers," Ezra said simply. "Been in these mountains since before the Cherokee, before the white settlers, before anyone kept records of such things. Most times they stay deep in the hollows, content to watch from the shadows. But storms like this, dark nights when the fog rolls thick, that's when they get curious about what passes through their territory." As if summoned by his words, Emma noticed movement in her peripheral vision. At first, she thought it was just the storm playing tricks with the shadows between the trees. But as she drove deeper into the forest, she began to see them clearly. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of glowing eyes scattered throughout the tree line at impossible heights, some 15-20 feet off the ground. "Jesus Christ," Emma whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The eyes weren't blinking. They tracked her truck's progress with predatory patience, appearing ahead of her headlights and disappearing into her mirrors with mechanical precision. "Don't take the Lord's name," Ezra said quietly. "They don't like it when folks call on powers they can't understand." He pointed toward the passenger window. "Look how high some of them eyes are. Ain't no natural creature gets that tall, miss. And see how they move through the trees without disturbing a single branch?" Emma's rational mind tried to find explanations. Reflection off raindrops, wildlife with unusually reflective eyes, maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by her headlights and the storm. But the eyes were too numerous, too coordinated, too deliberate in their tracking. Whatever was watching her truck move through the forest was intelligent, and there were a lot of them. "What do they want?" she managed to ask. "To understand," Ezra replied. "See, these mountains are old, and old places remember things. The watchers, they've seen everything that ever walked, drove, or flew through these woods. They collect experiences. Usually they're content to observe, but sometimes when something interests them enough, they try to get a closer look." As he spoke, Emma noticed her CB radio crackling with strange interference. Voices seemed to whisper just below the threshold of comprehension, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. The radio's display flickered between stations that shouldn't exist, picking up signals that seemed to come from somewhere other than Earth. Mile after mile, the eyes continued to pace her truck. Sometimes they would disappear for stretches, and Emma would start to convince herself the ordeal was over. Then they would return in greater numbers, closer to the road, their unblinking stare boring into her from the darkness. "How much further to sunrise?" she asked, though she'd lost track of time completely. Ezra checked an old pocket watch that seemed to tick backwards. "Few hours yet. But don't you worry, miss. Long as you keep moving, long as you don't give them cause to think you're stopping, they'll let you pass. They're curious, not malicious, most of the time." When Emma finally crested a hill and saw the first gray light of dawn bleeding through the storm clouds, the eyes began to fade back into the forest. One by one, they withdrew into the deep woods until the tree line looked normal again. Just a wall of dark vegetation lining an empty mountain highway. She turned to thank Ezra for his company during the long night, but the passenger seat was empty. The old man had vanished without a sound, leaving only wet footprints on her truck's floor mat and the lingering smell of old earth. Footprints that, when Emma looked closer, seemed far too deep for someone who had climbed out normally, as if whoever made them had sunk several inches into solid metal. The footprints smelled like grave dirt, like something that had been buried for decades and recently disturbed. And as Emma drove toward the sunrise, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ezra hadn't been warning her about the watchers in the woods. He'd been warning the watchers about her. Did you like this story? Please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video. Marcus Torres had been running freight through the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina for 12 years, and he thought he knew every trick the road could throw at him. Ice storms, fog so thick you couldn't see your own hood, breakdowns in the middle of nowhere. He'd survived it all. But nothing had prepared him for the night his own voice started hunting him through the mountain passes. It started around midnight on a lonely stretch of highway that wound through the dense forests of western North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. Marcus was hauling electronics from Charlotte to a distribution center in Tennessee, a route he'd driven hundreds of times before. The CB radio had been quiet most of the night, just the occasional chatter from other drivers warning about speed traps or weather conditions ahead. Then, clear as day, he heard his own voice come crackling through the speaker. "This is Marcus Torres in the blue Peterbilt, westbound mile marker 47, carrying electronics, over." The voice was perfect. His slight Puerto Rican accent, the way he always cleared his throat before transmitting, even the particular cadence he used when talking on the radio. But Marcus hadn't keyed his mic. His hands were firmly on the steering wheel and the radio handset hung undisturbed on its hook. Marcus grabbed the CB handset, his heart starting to race. "Who is this?" "This is Marcus Torres. Identify yourself." Static answered him for a long moment. Then that impossible familiar voice responded. "Negative. This is Marcus Torres. You're impersonating a commercial vehicle operator. State your actual call sign and location." The voice carried his exact inflections, but there was something wrong underneath. A hollow quality, like an echo of an echo. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. "Listen here, whoever you are," Marcus said into the handset. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but knock it off. This is my call sign, my truck, my route." The response chilled him to the bone. "Roger that, Marcus Torres, confirming identity. Switching to Channel 9 for emergency coordination." It was his voice again, but now it carried information he'd never transmitted. How did whoever this was know he sometimes monitored Channel 9? How did they know his truck model and color? Marcus switched to Channel 9, the emergency frequency, and immediately heard multiple voices. Truckers, dispatchers, even what sounded like state police. All discussing Marcus Torres. His location, his cargo, his estimated arrival times. But the details were wrong, impossibly wrong. They were reporting him on highways he'd never driven, carrying loads he'd never hauled, speaking to people he'd never met. "We have Marcus Torres northbound on Highway 421 requesting assistance with overheated engine," came a dispatcher's voice. But Marcus was headed west and his engine was running fine. "Marcus Torres reporting suspicious activity at the Blue Ridge truck stop," said what sounded like a state trooper. Marcus had never been to that truck stop, didn't even know where it was. The worst part was hearing his own voice responding to all of it. 10-4, this is Marcus Torres, engine temperature rising, need immediate assistance. Roger, Marcus Torres here saw 3 individuals acting suspiciously around parked vehicles. Each transmission was perfect, carried his speech patterns, his vocabulary, even personal details about his truck and cargo that no one else should know. Marcus switched back to the main channel but found it flooded with conversations involving his identity. Truckers were reporting seeing his blue Peterbilt at locations across 3 states simultaneously. Dispatchers were trying to coordinate with multiple Marcus Torres, each claiming to be the real one. The radio chatter grew increasingly frantic as the various parties tried to sort out which Marcus Torres was legitimate. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered, checking his mirrors nervously. The mountain road stretched empty behind him, just the reflection of his own taillights on the wet asphalt. But as he watched, he saw headlights appear in the distance. Another truck running dark except for the required lights matching his speed exactly. Marcus accelerated, and the distant truck accelerated too. He slowed down, and it slowed in perfect synchronization. The other vehicle maintained the same distance, like a mirror image reflected in time rather than space. Marcus squinted into his side mirror, trying to make out details, but the headlights were too bright and too far away. He grabbed the CB again. "Any drivers northbound? Can you see 2 blue Peterbilts running convoy? Need confirmation on bogey in my mirrors." The responses came immediately, but they weren't what he expected. "Negative on the convoy, Marcus Torres. Only showing 1 blue Pete on this stretch. This is Marcus Torres requesting that information, not providing it." his own voice again carrying confusion and irritation that perfectly matched what he was feeling. Dispatch. We have identity confusion with Marcus Torres, multiple operators using same call sign. The radio exploded with chatter as more voices joined in, all claiming to be Marcus Torres or to have information about him. He heard his voice reporting breakdowns he wasn't having, deliveries to locations he'd never heard of, conversations with dispatchers he'd never spoken to. Marcus reached up to turn off the CB entirely, but before he could, one final transmission came through in his own voice, clearer than all the others. Marcus Torres to any listening station. I think something is wearing my voice. I think it's learning how to be me. Marcus felt his hands shaking on the wheel. He'd heard his own voice deliver that warning, but he hadn't spoken those words. The transmission had come through with perfect clarity, carrying his accent, his inflections, his way of phrasing things. But underneath the familiar sound was something else. A desperate edge that suggested the speaker knew something terrible was happening to them. In his mirrors, the other truck had vanished. The road behind him was empty again, just mountain darkness and the faint reflection of his own lights. But on the CB, he could still hear faint chatter, dispatchers trying to reach Marcus Torres, truckers asking for his location, emergency services coordinating responses to incidents he wasn't involved in. When Marcus finally reached the Tennessee Distribution Center 3 hours later, the dock supervisor looked at him with confusion. "You're early, Marcus. Your delivery isn't scheduled until Thursday." Marcus checked his paperwork. Tuesday's date, Tuesday's schedule, Tuesday's load. But according to the supervisor's computer, Marcus Torres had already delivered this exact shipment 2 days ago. Signed all the paperwork, even chatted with the dock crew about his family back in Charlotte. Marcus stared at the electronic signature on the computer screen. It was his name in his handwriting, but he had no memory of making the delivery. As he stood there trying to make sense of what he was seeing, his CB crackled one final time with a transmission in his own voice. "Thanks for the delivery, Marcus. I'll take it from here." The voice was identical to his own, but as he listened, Marcus realized it had gotten something wrong. The accent was perfect, the inflection was right, but it had pronounced his mother's maiden name incorrectly. A name he'd mentioned to the dock supervisor during that delivery he couldn't remember. Whatever had been learning to be him wasn't quite perfect yet. It was close, impossibly close, but still learning. Marcus never found out what happened to the original delivery or who had made it in his place. But for the rest of his career, he drove with the CB turned off, afraid of what he might hear coming back to him in his own voice. Davids, Danny Lawson had been hauling hazmat materials through the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia for 15 years, and he'd seen plenty of strange things during those early morning runs when most of the world was still asleep. Deer crossing in impossible numbers, fog that seemed to move against the wind, abandoned vehicles that appeared and disappeared between trips. But nothing had prepared him for what he encountered that gray October dawn on a winding mountain road deep in the Virginia highlands. It was just past 6 in the morning when Danny spotted them through the lifting mist. A line of people walking single file along the narrow shoulder of the mountain highway. At first glance, they looked like any group of hikers who'd gotten an early start, maybe heading to one of the popular trailheads that dotted the region. But something about their movement caught his attention, made him ease off the accelerator as his 18-wheeler approached the group. They weren't walking like hikers. Their movements were too synchronized, too mechanical, like a line of sleepwalkers all sharing the same dream. There had to be 30 or 40 people in the procession, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothes that looked decades out of date. Long coats and formal dresses, heavy boots and wide-brimmed hats that belonged to another era entirely. Leading the strange parade was a tall, gaunt figure who stood out even among the unusual group. The man, if it was a man, wore a black suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s, complete with a high collar and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in deep shadow. He carried what appeared to be a shepherd's staff, an ornate wooden rod that he used to gesture toward the others whenever someone began to drift from the line. Danny slowed his truck to a crawl, partly out of caution and partly out of morbid curiosity. The people in the procession paid no attention to the approaching vehicle, didn't even glance up when his diesel engine rumbled past. Their eyes were fixed straight ahead, following their strange shepherd with unwavering devotion. But the leader, he looked up as Danny passed, tipping his hat in a gesture so polite and old-fashioned that it sent chills down the trucker's spine. The man's face was gaunt and pale, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed far too dark for the morning light. When he smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp, Danny felt his foot press harder on the accelerator. There was something predatory in that smile, something that suggested the politeness was just a mask covering something much hungrier underneath. Danny checked his mirrors as he pulled ahead of the group, watching them continue their steady march along the roadside. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going, following their leader toward some destination that existed beyond the normal world. The sight made Danny's skin crawl, but he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. He had a delivery to make, and whatever local religious group or historical reenactment society was holding their early morning procession wasn't his concern. But as he climbed higher into the mountains, following the winding road toward his destination, Danny began to notice something that made his blood run cold. The procession was keeping pace with his truck. No matter how fast he drove, when he checked his mirrors, the line of followers was still visible in the distance, still marching with that same mechanical precision. It should have been impossible. He was doing nearly 60 miles per hour on the straightaways, far faster than any group of people could walk, even if they were jogging. Danny tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was a different group. Maybe there were multiple processions using different roads that converged with the highway at various points. But when he looked closer, he could make out individual details. The woman in the faded blue dress, the elderly man with the walking cane, the child who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. It was the same group, somehow maintaining the same distance despite the physical impossibility of what he was witnessing. The road began to curve sharply as it followed the contours of the mountain, and Danny found himself approaching a section where the highway had been carved directly into the cliff face. To his right, the mountain rose in a sheer wall of granite and limestone, while to his left, the ground dropped away into a misty valley hundreds of feet below. It was a treacherous section of road that demanded his full attention, but he couldn't stop glancing in his mirrors at the impossible procession. As he entered the steepest part of the curve, hugging the mountain wall, Danny saw something that made him slam on his brakes so hard that his trailer jackknifed slightly before the anti-lock system brought him to a controlled stop. The procession had reached the cliff face, but instead of stopping or turning back, they were walking directly into the solid rock. One by one, the followers stepped into the granite wall and disappeared, absorbed into the mountain as if the stone were nothing more than morning mist. Danny sat in his cab, engine idling, watching in stunned disbelief as the entire group vanished into the mountainside. The shepherd went last, pausing at the rock face to turn and look directly at Danny's truck. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, the trucker could feel those dark eyes boring into him, could see that predatory smile spreading across the gaunt face. The figure raised his staff in what might have been a salute or a blessing, then stepped backward into the solid stone and disappeared. For several minutes, Danny sat motionless, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Hallucinations brought on by fatigue, Some kind of optical illusion created by the morning mist, maybe even carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in his exhaust system. But the image of those people walking into solid rock remained vivid and undeniable. Eventually, Danny put the truck back in gear and continued toward his delivery point, but he couldn't shake the memory of what he'd seen. When he reached the chemical plant where he was supposed to unload his cargo, he mentioned the strange procession to the dock supervisor, describing the old-fashioned clothes and the tall leader with the shepherd's staff. The supervisor, a local man named Bill Henderson who'd lived in the mountains his entire life, went pale when he heard the description. "You saw them too, huh?" Bill said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That's the third driver this month who's reported the same thing. Always the same spot on the mountain, always walking into the rock face." Bill explained that the area had a dark history dating back to the 1920s. A mining operation had been established in those mountains, drawing workers from across the region with promises of steady pay and good living conditions. The mine had been run by a charismatic preacher named Jeremiah Blackwood, who convinced his followers that they were doing God's work by extracting the earth's treasures. Story goes that Blackwood started getting strange ideas about salvation, Bill continued. Told his people that the only way to reach heaven was to follow him into the heart of the mountain, where they'd find a paradise that existed beyond the physical world. One morning in October 1924, the entire community, men, women, children, nearly 200 people, followed Blackwood into the deepest shaft of the mine. The entrance had collapsed behind them, whether by accident or design, no one knew. Rescue teams had worked for weeks trying to dig through the rubble, but they never found any trace of Blackwood or his followers. The bodies were never recovered, and eventually the mine was abandoned and sealed. Local folks say they still see the procession sometimes, Bill finished. Always in October, always at dawn, still following their shepherd into the mountain. Most people think it's just stories, but you truckers who drive these roads at all hours, you see things the rest of us miss. Danny completed his delivery and headed back down the mountain. But he took a different route, one that avoided the cliff face entirely. He never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed that morning, but he made sure to warn other hazmat drivers about the dangerous curves and poor visibility on that particular stretch of highway. He never mentioned the real reason he avoided the road, the fear that one morning he might be tempted to stop his truck and follow the shepherd's flock into whatever paradise or damnation waited beyond the stone. Jake Harrison had been running equipment through the remote mountain passes of eastern Kentucky for 8 years, and he prided himself on maintaining the cleanest, most organized cab in the fleet. Everything had its place, every personal item carefully secured, every surface wiped down at the end of each shift. That's why he noticed immediately when the photograph appeared on his dashboard during a routine stop at a mountain truck stop deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The picture wasn't his. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile standing in front of what looked like a farmhouse from decades past. The photo had the faded sepia quality of something from the 1950s or 60s, with slightly bent corners that suggested it had been carried in someone's wallet for years. Jake picked it up, turning it over to find a message written in careful cursive. "To my beloved Thomas, until we meet again. Mary." Jake's first thought was that another driver had accidentally left it behind, maybe dropped it when using the restroom or buying coffee. He pocketed the photo, planning to ask around the truck stop if anyone was missing a family picture. But when he questioned the cashier and the few other drivers present, none of them claimed ownership of the photograph. The cashier, an elderly mountain woman with knowing eyes, just shook her head and muttered something about things that follow the lonely roads. 2 hours later, as Jake navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of mountain highway, he discovered a child's toy on his passenger seat. It was a small wooden horse, hand-carved and painted in bright primary colors that had faded with age. The toy showed signs of being well-loved, smooth spots where small fingers had worn away the paint, tiny scratches and dents that spoke of countless hours of play. Jake was certain it hadn't been there when he'd started driving, and he couldn't explain how it had appeared in his locked cab. He pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, searching his truck thoroughly for any sign of how someone might have planted the items. The doors had been locked, the windows closed, and he hadn't stopped or picked up any passengers. Yet there was the toy, sitting innocently on his passenger seat as if it had always belonged there. Jake placed it on his dashboard next to the photograph, telling himself there had to be a logical explanation. The CB radio crackled to life as he merged back onto the highway, but instead of the usual chatter between drivers, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a woman's voice, faint and filled with static, calling out desperately, "Thomas? Thomas, can you hear me? I'm waiting at the farmhouse. Please come home." The voice matched the era of the photograph, formal pronunciation, careful diction that belonged to another time. Jake grabbed his CB handset. "This is Big Jake on Channel 19, who's broadcasting on this frequency." But the voice continued without acknowledging his transmission, repeating the same plea over and over with increasing desperation. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the transmission cut off, leaving only empty static. Over the next several hours, more items appeared in Jake's cab. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses materialized on his dashboard, the lenses cracked but still functional. A wedding ring rolled out from under his seat, the gold band tarnished with age and inscribed with initials he didn't recognize. Each object seemed to carry its own history, its own story of loss and separation. With each new item came voices on the CB radio, men, women, children, all calling out to loved ones, all seeming to broadcast from somewhere beyond the normal range of radio transmission. Jake heard a child crying for his mother, an elderly man asking his son to visit, a young woman pleading for her husband to remember their anniversary. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a chorus of longing that filled his cab with an overwhelming sense of loss. Jake tried changing channels, but the voices followed him across the entire CB spectrum. He turned the radio off completely, but somehow the voices continued to emerge from the silent speaker, growing louder and more insistent as darkness fell over the mountain road. They weren't just random transmissions anymore, they were responding to his presence, calling out to him specifically. "Please," came a voice that sounded like the woman from the photograph. "You have her picture. You can bring her back to me. Just follow the old mountain road to the farmhouse." Another voice, this one belonging to a child, added, "You have my horse. I've been looking for it for so long. Please bring it home." Jake realized with growing horror that the items weren't randomly appearing in his truck. They were being placed there deliberately by something that wanted him to return them to their original owners. But the owners were calling to him from what sounded like decades in the past, their voices carrying the hollow quality of people who were no longer entirely present in the world of the living. As he drove deeper into the mountain wilderness, more personal effects continued to manifest in his cab. A harmonica appeared on his seat, still warm as if someone had just finished playing it. A child's drawing materialized on his floor mat, showing a family standing in front of a house that looked remarkably similar to the farmhouse in the photograph. Each new item brought with it another voice on the CB radio, another plea for reunion, another request to bring them home. The voices began to coordinate, speaking in unison at times, providing directions to locations that Jake was certain no longer existed. "Turn left at the old oak tree," they would say, or "follow the creek bed to the stone bridge." The instructions were detailed and specific, but they referenced landmarks that might have been destroyed or changed decades ago. Jake's rational mind told him to ignore the voices, to dispose of the mysterious items and continue on his planned route. But something deeper, something that responded to the desperate longing in those otherworldly transmissions, urged him to follow their directions. The items on his dashboard seemed to pulse with their own inner light, drawing his attention away from the road and toward whatever destination the voices were guiding him toward. As midnight approached, Jake found himself turning onto progressively smaller roads, following directions that led him away from his intended route and deeper into the isolated heart of the Appalachian wilderness. The voices on the CB grew stronger and clearer, no longer fading in and out with static, but speaking with the clarity of people standing right beside his truck. The final item to appear was his own driver's license, though Jake was certain it had never left his wallet. When he checked his pocket, his wallet was still there and his license was still inside it. But there on his dashboard sat an identical copy, except the photograph showed a face that wasn't quite his own. The features were similar, but the eyes held a hollow quality that reminded him of the voices on the CB radio. The name was still Jake Harrison, but underneath, in the space where his address should have been, someone had written in that same careful cursive, "Collection complete. Welcome home." Jake looked up from the impossible license to find himself parked in front of a farmhouse that matched the one in the photograph exactly, despite the fact that he was certain he'd been driving on a mountain highway just moments before. The voices on the CB had gone silent, but through his windshield he could see figures moving in the windows of the house, silhouettes that seemed to be waiting for him to bring them their treasured possessions, to complete whatever collection he'd unknowingly become part of during his journey through the collector's highway. Tommy Briggs first heard about the impossible road from other drivers at a truck stop in the Tennessee mountains, spoken about in hushed tones over coffee and pie at 3 in the morning. Veterans of the Appalachian routes would mention it in passing, always prefacing their stories with warnings about staying on the main highways and never following GPS directions that led too far off the beaten path. They called it different names: the Devil's Loop, the Hungry Highway, the Road to Nowhere. But they all described the same phenomenon, a stretch of mountain asphalt that didn't behave like normal pavement should. Tommy had been hauling lumber through the Appalachian Mountains for 6 years, and he'd always prided himself on being practical, skeptical of the ghost stories and supernatural tales that seemed to flourish in these isolated communities. When his GPS unit malfunctioned during a late-night run through the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee, routing him onto progressively smaller roads that wound deeper into the wilderness, he figured it was just another case of outdated mapping software leading him astray. The road started normally enough, a 2-lane mountain highway that curved gently through dense forest, with the familiar yellow lines marking the center and proper reflectors guiding the way. But as Tommy drove deeper into the mountains, following what his GPS insisted was the fastest route to his destination, he began to notice subtle wrongness in the pavement beneath his wheels. The asphalt seemed to ripple slightly, like water disturbed by a stone responding to the weight of his truck in ways that solid road surface shouldn't. At first, Tommy attributed the strange sensations to fatigue or perhaps a problem with his truck's suspension. But as he continued driving, the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. The road beneath him would swell and dip without warning, creating hills and valleys that hadn't been there moments before. When he looked in his mirrors, the highway behind him appeared perfectly flat and normal, but ahead the pavement continued its impossible undulations. The mile markers began changing as he watched them. He passed mile marker 15, then just a few minutes later encountered mile marker 12, as if the road had somehow shortened itself while he was driving. The guardrails twisted and reformed themselves, bending into new configurations that defied the basic geometry of highway construction. Tommy slowed to a crawl, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. but the road seemed to respond to his caution by stretching longer, making the distances between landmarks increase exponentially. Tommy pulled over at what appeared to be a rest area, but when he climbed out of his cab to inspect his truck and gather his thoughts, he discovered that the rest area was nothing more than a widening in the road with no facilities, no signs, nothing to indicate why the pavement had expanded in that particular spot. The asphalt beneath his feet felt warm, almost body temperature, and when he knelt to touch it, the surface yielded slightly under pressure like living tissue. He tried to call for help on his CB radio, but the only response came in his own voice, broadcasting from somewhere ahead on the road. "This is Tommy Briggs requesting assistance," came his own transmission, clear and distinct. "I'm lost on a mountain highway that keeps changing. If anyone receives this, I'm driving a red Kenworth hauling lumber, but I don't know where I am anymore." Tommy hadn't made that transmission. He was certain of it. But the voice was unmistakably his, carrying his accent, his speech patterns, even his habit of clearing his throat before speaking into the microphone. When Tommy climbed back into his cab and tried to continue, he discovered that the road ahead had split into 3 separate highways, each leading in different directions through the forest. His GPS showed only one route, but his eyes clearly saw 3 distinct paths. He chose the middle road, but within minutes found himself back at the same 3-way split, approaching it from a different angle as if he'd made a complete circle without realizing it. The radio continued to broadcast his voice from different points along the road. Sometimes the transmission seemed to come from ahead of him, sometimes from behind, occasionally from what sounded like directly underneath his truck. The messages grew increasingly desperate. "I've been driving this road for hours. The sun should have come up by now, but it's still dark. The mile markers keep changing. I passed mile marker 8 6 times in the last hour. Something's wrong with this highway. It's like it's alive." Tommy realized with growing horror that he was hearing transmissions from himself, not just his voice, but apparently from other versions of himself who had encountered this road before, or perhaps from future versions who were still trapped on it. The broadcasts overlapped and contradicted each other, creating a confusing timeline of Tommy Briggs' drivers all lost on the same impossible stretch of asphalt. As the night wore on, Tommy encountered more evidence that the road was somehow collecting the experiences of everyone who had ever driven on it. He passed abandoned vehicles from different eras, a 1960s pickup truck, a station wagon from the 1970s, a motorcycle that looked like it belonged in the 1980s. All of them were positioned along the shoulder as if their drivers had simply gotten out and walked away, leaving their vehicles to become part of the road's permanent collection. The highway began to show him scenes from its own memory. Tommy would round a curve and suddenly see the road as it had appeared decades ago, unpaved and rutted, with a horse-drawn wagon struggling through mud that had long since been covered by asphalt. Other times he glimpsed the road as it might appear in the future, with vehicles he didn't recognize using, technology that seemed impossibly advanced. Most disturbing were the moments when Tommy saw other drivers who looked exactly like him, driving identical red Kenworths and hauling the same lumber cargo. Sometimes they drove in the opposite direction, passing him with waves and horn blasts that he found himself returning automatically. Other times they drove parallel to him on roads that shouldn't have been there, matching his speed perfectly while remaining just visible in his peripheral vision. Tommy's fuel gauge showed impossible readings, sometimes full, sometimes empty, sometimes displaying levels that exceeded the tank's capacity. His odometer spun wildly, adding thousands of miles in minutes, then reversing to show negative mileage as if he were driving backward through distance itself. The clock on his dashboard showed times that contradicted each other, displaying different hours on its digital readout than on its analog display. The final transmission Tommy heard in his own voice was the most chilling. "I understand now. The road doesn't just remember the people who've driven on it, it keeps them. We're all still here, all still driving, all still trying to find our way out. But the road needs us. It feeds on our attempts to escape, grows stronger every time we try to leave. I can see dozens of myself now, maybe hundreds, all driving the same route, all thinking we're the original Tommy Briggs. Maybe we all are. Maybe the road creates us as it needs us. As dawn should have broken over the mountains, Tommy found himself parked beside his own truck, an identical red Kenworth in the same parking spot he'd occupied moments before. The other Tommy sat in the cab, speaking into his CB radio, broadcasting the same desperate messages Tommy had been sending all night. When the other version of himself looked up and made eye contact through the windshield, Tommy realized that he was no longer driving on the road that remembers. He had become part of what it remembers. Another echo trapped in its endless appetite for travelers who venture too far into the hungry heart of the Appalachian wilderness. Bobby Williams had been hauling heavy machinery through the Appalachian mountains of West Virginia for over 2 decades, and he'd experienced every kind of mechanical failure the road could throw at him. Blown tires on mountain passes, overheated engines in summer heat, transmission problems that left him stranded for hours waiting for roadside assistance. But he'd never had his truck simply die without warning on a perfectly clear October night. Coasting to a stop on a remote mountain highway surrounded by the densest forest he'd ever encountered. The engine didn't sputter or cough. It just went silent as if someone had thrown a switch. The dashboard lights flickered once and died, leaving Bobby in complete darkness except for the faint glow of his emergency flashlight. He tried the ignition several times but got no response, not even the clicking sound of a dead battery. It was as if his truck had simply decided to stop being a mechanical device and become a very large, very expensive sculpture. Bobby climbed out of his cab to inspect the engine, but as soon as his feet touched the asphalt, he noticed the unsettling silence that had settled over the mountain road. In 20 years of driving these routes, he'd never experienced such complete quiet in the Appalachian forest. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had stopped moving through the trees, leaving the air so still it felt thick and oppressive. The forest pressed close to both sides of the narrow mountain highway, creating walls of darkness that seemed to absorb his flashlight beam rather than reflect it. The trees were massive, old growth that must have been standing for centuries, and they leaned inward over the road as if they were trying to close the gap above his truck. When Bobby shined his light upward, he couldn't see sky through the canopy, just an interwoven mass of branches that blocked out even the faintest starlight. As Bobby examined his engine, checking connections and looking for obvious problems, he began to feel the peculiar sensation that he was being observed. At first, he attributed it to normal anxiety about being stranded alone in the wilderness, but the feeling grew stronger and more specific. It wasn't just the general unease of isolation, it was the distinct impression that multiple sets of eyes were watching him from the tree line, studying his every movement with predatory attention. Bobby raised his flashlight and swept it across the forest edge, looking for the telltale reflection of animal eyes. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. Scattered throughout the trees at various heights and distances were pale shapes that looked disturbingly human. They stood perfectly motionless among the tree trunks, their faces turned toward him with an intensity that was clearly intelligent rather than merely curious. The shapes were tall, impossibly tall, standing at heights that would put them well above normal human proportions. Some appeared to be 15 or 20 feet in height, while others seemed even larger, their heads visible above the lower branches of the surrounding trees. Their skin, if it could be called skin, had a luminous quality that made them visible even in the darkness. But when Bobby tried to focus his flashlight directly on any individual figure, It would fade from view as if his direct attention somehow diminished its ability to manifest. Bobby counted at least 30 of the pale watchers scattered throughout the visible forest, but he suspected there were many more lurking beyond the range of his flashlight. They didn't move or make sound, but their presence was overwhelming, filling the quiet night with a sense of ancient intelligence that had been disturbed by his unexpected stop. The longer he observed them, the more details he could make out. Elongated limbs, faces that were almost human but somehow wrong in their proportions, and eyes that reflected his flashlight beam with an inner light that seemed to come from somewhere other than his equipment. Bobby tried his CB radio, hoping to reach another driver or emergency services, but the radio produced only static, punctuated occasionally by what sounded like whispered conversations in languages he didn't recognize. The voices seemed to be discussing him, though he couldn't understand the words, and he had the unsettling impression that the pale watchers were communicating with each other about his presence in their territory. The truck's engine remained stubbornly dead despite Bobby's increasingly frantic attempts to restart it. He checked every connection he could reach with his basic tools, but everything appeared normal. The battery terminals were clean, the belts were intact, and there were no obvious signs of mechanical failure. It was as if something had simply reached into his engine and turned off whatever force animates mechanical devices, leaving him stranded in the middle of the Watcher's domain. As the night deepened, more of the pale figures emerged from the forest depths, taking positions closer to the road. They moved when Bobby wasn't looking directly at them, appearing in new locations whenever he turned his attention elsewhere. What had started as a handful of distant observers had grown into a crowd of towering presences that surrounded his truck on all sides, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly indicating that he was now completely encircled. Bobby noticed that the figures closer to his truck showed more detail, as if proximity allowed him to see them more clearly. Their faces, while maintaining an overall human structure, showed subtle differences that marked them as something other than ordinary people. Their eyes were too large and too dark, their mouths too wide, their limbs too long and too thin. They wore no clothing that he could discern, but their luminous skin seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, constantly changing texture and opacity. The most disturbing aspect of his situation was the intelligence he could see in their behavior. These weren't animals reacting to a strange presence in their territory. They were thinking beings, making deliberate decisions about how to respond to his intrusion. Bobby could see them gesturing to each other, pointing at different parts of his truck, apparently discussing strategy or sharing observations about the mechanical device that had brought him into their realm. The way their limbs moved was unnatural, elongated, almost liquid in motion, but precise, as if every movement had a purpose that he could not comprehend. Their pale, almost translucent skin reflected the dim moonlight, making their sinewy muscles and exaggerated joints glow faintly in the darkness. Bobby's heart pounded so violently that he was certain the rhythm of it must echo through the trees, alerting every watcher within the forest. He tried to tell himself they couldn't understand him, couldn't possibly know what he was thinking. But then one of the creatures raised a hand and pointed directly at him, and for the briefest moment he felt an undeniable connection. It was not empathy, not recognition, but understanding. Cold, calculating, and terrifying in its clarity. They weren't merely observing, they were analyzing, cataloging him as a problem to be solved. Around 3 a.m, Bobby heard footsteps approaching his truck from behind. Heavy, deliberate steps that suggested something much larger than a normal person. The crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs was deafening in the otherwise eerie silence, a drumbeat of impending doom. He turned with his flashlight, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped it, and saw one of the pale watchers had approached to within 20 feet of his trailer. The figure stood nearly 12 feet tall, with proportions that stretched the human form to impossible dimensions. Its head tilted as it examined Bobby, and when their eyes met, Bobby felt a sensation like ice water flooding his veins. The giant watcher extended one enormously long arm toward Bobby's truck, not quite touching the metal but holding its hand just inches from the trailer's surface. Where the creature's palm hovered, Bobby could see his truck's paint begin to bubble and change color, as if the thing's presence was somehow altering the molecular structure of the materials. The air around the hand shimmered with a heatless intensity, distorting the faint glow of his headlights. Bobby's stomach turned as he watched the trailer twist subtly under the invisible force, the steel groaning as though the truck itself were alive and screaming in pain. The watcher's mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, glinting with a phosphorescent sheen. Then came the sound, a noise that defied comprehension. Part whisper, part growl, part something that human ears weren't designed to process. It reverberated directly inside Bobby's skull, bypassing his eardrums entirely, and he clutched at his head, gagging and trembling. He could feel the sound attempting to probe his mind to uncover every hidden fear, every memory he'd buried and every thought he'd tried to forget. Bobby pressed himself against his cab, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the approaching watcher. But as he moved, he realized that all the pale figures had begun to close their circle, stepping out from behind trees and moving across the forest floor with a fluid grace that defied their enormous size. Their movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, each footfall precise and silent despite the mass of their bodies. They weren't approaching aggressively, not yet, but with the careful, patient movement of beings who had all the time in the world and knew their prey had nowhere to run. The forest seemed to bend around them, shadows stretching unnaturally toward Bobby, wrapping the clearing in a suffocating cloak of darkness. He tried to breathe, tried to calm the panic rising in his chest, but it was futile. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to escape, to drive his truck into the night and never look back. Yet he was paralyzed, mesmerized by the creature's intelligence, their methodical assessment of him, the way they seemed to communicate silently through the tilt of a head or the flick of a wrist. Bobby had never felt so completely observed, so thoroughly understood by beings he had no hope of understanding in return. Memories of other truckers' stories drifted into his mind, tales of strange lights, unexplained disappearances along isolated highways, whispers of beings larger than men and stranger than nightmares. He had always dismissed them, thought them drunken tales swapped over coffee and stale donuts. But now he understood with gut-wrenching clarity that those stories were true, and he had just become the protagonist in one of them. Just as Bobby was certain that the watchers intended to do something terrible to him, his truck's engine roared to life without any input from him. Every system came online simultaneously, lights, radio, air conditioning, all functioning perfectly as if there had never been a problem. The sudden ignition of the engine startled both Bobby and the watchers, the thunderous roar echoing into the trees and momentarily halting their movements. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as if the forest itself was frozen, as if the creatures were assessing whether this machine posed a real threat or merely a distraction. Bobby didn't wait to interpret their silence. He threw himself into the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, and gunned the engine. Tires squealed against the asphalt as he pulled back onto the highway, the smell of burning rubber filling his nostrils. The truck leapt forward with a force that almost lifted him from his seat, and for the first time since he had entered the forest, Bobby felt a sliver of hope. In his mirrors he could see the pale watchers withdrawing back into the forest, fading among the tree trunks until they were indistinguishable from shadows and moonlight. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, almost resigned, as if they had accomplished their purpose of observing and testing. But Bobby knew they would not forget him. Their eyes had burned into his mind, a permanent record of his presence, and he was certain they would follow him in one form or another for the rest of his life. When he reached the next truck stop 50 miles down the road, Bobby discovered that his truck bore evidence of the encounter that couldn't be explained away as imagination or fatigue. Pressed deep into the metal of his trailer were dozens of handprints, impossibly large handprints that had been burned into the steel with heat so intense it had actually melted the surface, leaving permanent impressions of palms and fingers that belonged to no earthly creature Bobby had ever heard of. Each print was perfectly formed, as if the creature had deliberately pressed its hand into the metal, studying it, marking it, claiming it in some incomprehensible ritual. Bobby ran his fingers over the prints, feeling the warped metal edges cut into his skin. They were cold to the touch but emanated a strange vibration, almost a hum, as though the metal itself remembered the encounter and was reluctant to let it go. He stepped back and looked around the truck stop, half expecting to see the watchers lurking among the shadows, but there was nothing, just the flickering neon lights, the empty parking lot, and the faint sound of a radio playing some long-forgotten country song in the distance. Sleep eluded him that night. He sat in the cab of his truck staring at the handprints, trying to rationalize what he had witnessed. He ran through every possibility: hallucination, exhaustion, a trick of the mind. But no theory could account for the physical evidence embedded in the steel of his trailer, or the way the forest seemed to reach into his memory, haunting him even in the harsh fluorescent lights of the truck stop. As dawn approached, Bobby finally allowed himself to step out of the cab and stretch his legs. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and something metallic, as if the forest itself had exhaled a warning. He scanned the tree line nervously, half expecting the watchers to emerge and continue their observation. But the woods were silent, as if the creatures had retreated, leaving behind only the lingering trace of their presence in the burned metal and in Bobby's mind. He thought about calling someone, the authorities, another trucker, anyone who might believe him. But even as he fumbled for his phone, he realized the futility. Who would believe him? Who could comprehend beings that defied nature, that possessed intelligence and power beyond human understanding? He would be labeled insane, a man unraveling in the isolation of the highway night. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth, but also a strange relief. He was alone, yes, but alive, and for now that was enough. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night refused to fade. Bobby found himself waking in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking, convinced he could hear the whispering growl, the impossible footsteps, the subtle movements of those enormous forms in the darkness. He tried to drive, to continue his routes as if nothing had happened, but his mind was always alert, scanning the shadows along every tree line, every overpass, every rest stop. He could never shake the feeling that they were still watching, analyzing, waiting for another chance to study him. And sometimes, late at night, when the highway stretched endless and empty before him, Bobby thought he could see a faint shimmer in the tree line, a ripple in the air, and the vague outline of a figure taller than any human should be. His hands would tighten on the wheel, his pulse would spike, and the memories of that impossible night would wash over him in waves of icy terror. The handprints on his trailer remained, silent evidence of what had occurred, a permanent scar etched into metal that no explanation could erase. Bobby knew deep down that the forest had claimed a part of him that night. Not physically, but mentally, spiritually, in a way that would haunt every mile he ever drove again. He had glimpsed beings beyond human comprehension, and in doing so had crossed a boundary he could never uncross. There was no forgetting. There was no escape. Only the road, the forest, and the pale watchers who, somewhere in the darkness, remembered him as clearly as he remembered them. Did you enjoy these stories? Let me know in the comments and tell me which one you liked the most. Don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to Horror Whispers for more chilling tales.